Okay, so hi everybody. I'm really glad that a few of you have made it over here from the other room for Kate's talk, and hopefully some other people will be joining around, and everybody can share this on social media, and that would get the word out even more. But I don't want to run too late. So Kate has taught English for academic purposes at the University of Iowa, the University of Northern Iowa, and the University of Tennessee at Martin. Her research interests include vocabulary, speech acts, language play, critical and creative thinking, listening strategies, writing feedback, and learner independence and autonomy. And you can find Kate online both through her really good blog. I've been following it actually since TOSCON, and where she shares quite a bit of video in terms of how she does some different tasks with her class. And if you want to follow her on Twitter, you can go to her Twitter handle there. And the last thing I really want to say is that Kate is soon to be a colleague of mine at the University of Toronto. So she's going to join my writing team in September, and I'm really looking forward to it. So I can't wait to see what you have to say today. So Kate, I'm going to move it over to you now, and have a great session.
Great, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. I've never presented on a webinar like this before, so I'm going to try to respond to what you say in the comments. So if any questions come up as I'm speaking, or if you need me to speak more loudly, or anything at all, let me know in the comments, and I'll try to keep an eye on those. So like Tyson said, I've been teaching at a few different universities, but I still consider myself a pretty new teacher. I've been teaching for about 4 years in English for academic purposes, but before that, I was working in a university writing center at the University of Tennessee at Martin. One of my favorite things to teach is writing, and I feel like I'm always trying new types of feedback and new ways to engage with students and work on making them better writers or helping them to become better writers and more confident writers. And one thing that I recently realized, which seems like a weird thing to just realize now, is that the 4 years of experience I had in the Writing Center at the University of Tennessee at Martin really inform what I do in the classroom now, and I'm sure will continue to inform what I do in the classroom for many years to come. So the first question that I have is, I want to know what you know about university writing centers. Has anyone ever worked at a writing center or sent students to a writing center, or do you not know what a writing center is? Just want to see what people know about writing centers. So if you could type in the chat box. All right, so an in-house center for students, that's great. UT Martin was a pretty small university, about 8,000 students on campus, I think about 3,000 online. So there was only one writing center, so I got to work with students who were non-native, native, fluent, not fluent, business majors, engineering majors, people working on English assignments, lots of different things. Yeah, exactly. So writing tutors give support to students with their writing. And I think that word support is going to be really central to what I have to say today. Some more comments are coming in. Usually it's one-on-one conferences, although they do organize some workshops, which is another thing that I'll touch on briefly. Yeah, and I really like what Sharon said about that the work that's done in a writing center includes ideas development as well as editing. A lot of students and maybe even teachers don't realize that it's perfectly okay to come to a writing center and say, here's my assignment, now where do I start? So there's support for all the different stages in the writing process. The pictures that I show in these slides are pictures that I took at the writing center where I worked. So here's an image of one of those one-on-one tutoring sessions. Okay, you can see this is actually an article, so they're working on reading development, which is another thing that writing centers do. And then you can also see in this image there are many students working independently. Another important thing that a writing center provides is just a space where students can come and work by themselves, share different resources. We had a resource library. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we had a resources library. This is part of it behind the woman on the right's head. Lots of different resources on citing sources, just tons of good stuff. So it's a really good space to have on campus. Next I'm going to show you some quotes that actually come from writing center websites so that we can start to look at the philosophies and ideas underlying writing center practice. Okay, so this is from the UT Martin Writing Center website, and you can see these tutoring sessions are aimed at helping students become better writers by identifying areas that the student can work on, including recurring grammatical errors, organization, and proper citation of sources. It's a pretty short quote. It seems kind of basic, but I think that there are some key words and ideas here that we as teachers can take away to help us assess student writing better and also provide more meaningful feedback. So do you have any ideas about which words in this quote might be some of the key words to understanding writing instruction? Yeah, the whole last bit. You can see that there are a few different focuses that these sessions can have. Yeah, grammatical errors, organization, citation of sources. Those are all things that we as instructors need to focus on. And I think sometimes it can be easy to get caught up on these grammatical errors and forget about the organization. And yeah, identifying areas of improvement is also a key idea here. So I've highlighted some of the key words that I think are in this quote, and there's an image of me back in the day. So one thing that I think is really central to writing instruction that I really didn't have explicitly pointed out to me in my graduate studies is that we're working on writers. We're not working on pieces of writing. Okay, it doesn't matter if a student writes an incredible essay if they don't feel confident afterwards and they don't feel like they can do it again. And I think it can be really easy to look at a stack of essays and just look at them as pieces of writing rather than as artifacts showing where a particular writer is in his or her writing development. So writing center tutors as well as writing teachers work with writers. The pieces of writing are just a means to an end, just a way to help the writer improve. And we're identifying areas, okay? An area has to be bigger than one mistake. You know, if somebody forgets the third person plural S, or third person singular S, sorry, on a verb, that is a mistake. It may not be an area, so it may not be valuable to draw the student's attention to that. And this is a habit that I've really had a difficult time getting myself out of, even having had experience in a writing center. You know, you're reading an essay, and the natural thing for a lot of teachers to do is to have the red pen, and you see that third person singular S, and you just want to mark it out. But that may not actually be very helpful, and it doesn't really help the writer to develop. Another thing I found interesting in this quote was that the student can work. If we're marking all of our students' mistakes, we're doing the work. The students need to be doing the work. So we need to be thinking about how to make the writing, the process of writing and the process of editing, the student's job. And also, we need to think about the kind of support that can actually help them rather than overwhelm them. Okay, so not too much red ink on the paper. And then this word recurring, I think, is also key in meaningful writing feedback. Okay, are there any questions so far? All right, if there are any, just let me know. Oh, another thing that I wanted to say about this image that was just interesting, something interesting that my writing center did. There are all of these files, and each of those files is for a different student who was in English 100 or 110, which was sort of a remedial, I don't like that word, but it was kind of a remedial composition class for students who didn't meet the minimum test requirement for the university. And students who were in these classes were required to come to the writing center for, I forget the exact number, but a couple of hours each week to get support from the writing center tutors. So the university really bought into this idea that this one-on-one meaningful feedback was important for developing writers. And we had these files where we would keep notes about every single session, and so this is the student's writing development right there in that file. Teachers could probably do something similar. A portfolio could include some feedback forms. All right, so next I have a quote from another writing center. This is from Brigham Young University, and I'll give you a moment to read it and then type the key words that you see in this quotation. Yeah, there are lots of great verbs here. Develop, strategies, confidence, ability. The key word here, the subject is writers, okay? It's not the teachers develop the students' ideas. No, it's the writers develop their ideas. This is all about the writer being able to do these things with some support, okay? So yeah, revision strategies. So there are great verbs here: develop, consider, discuss, increase. Okay, really great verbs. I'm going to go to the next slide, which has some of the words that I thought were key. Okay, so consider. I thought this was an interesting word here because one of the keys of writing center tutoring is that the student maintains ownership of the paper at all times. And all decisions that are made, all revisions or thesis statements that the student decides on, all of those are the student's decision. Okay, the Writing Center tutor is simply there to help, to give a response, to discuss revision strategies. I probably should have put discuss in red as well. They're learning strategies, right? If I go through with a red pen and just mark what's wrong with the paper, that's my strategy. That's not the student's strategy. Okay, so it's important to develop the student's strategies. We discussed writing principles. I think it's interesting here that the word is not rules. Okay, they're writing principles. And then the students can make their own choices about which rules they agree with and which rules they don't agree with. And increase their confidence and abilities in writing, which is great. And I think often confidence and abilities go hand in hand. So it's important that we're developing their abilities, which can sometimes include saying things that might be a little hard to hear, like, this part is unclear, I'm not sure what you're trying to say here. But we also have to work on improving their confidence. And part of that is asking questions and saying, okay, this part isn't clear, but I think you can make it better. So can you maybe tell me what you were trying to say, and then we can work on getting that down into writing. Okay, I feel like I often had to tell students really awful things, not awful, but hard to hear things about their writing. Like, this doesn't make sense, this is hard to understand, you have grammatical issues. But I think that when the student maintains control and you instruct the student by asking questions, they still are the expert on their piece of writing. You're not telling them what to do, you're asking them what they think they should do. So they're still the expert in the relationship. All right, so next I'm going to put up some links to writing centers that I'm familiar with, that I have some kind of connection to. And I would like you to click on one or more of the links and take a couple minutes to notice some of the principles and practices. These are frequently asked questions that come from students and teachers. And we're going to get to see some of the pedagogy and the practices that go into Writing Center tutoring sessions by looking at these frequently asked questions. Okay, so I hope the links will work. Let me know if they don't. Okay, I'll put the links in the chat box. I had them pulled up just in case, so this is okay. Okay, so you have 4 choices. Take a couple minutes to browse. You can copy and paste anything of interest in the chat box. You're finding really good things. Yeah, nope, sorry. Our job is to help you become a better writer. That's probably my favorite thing that I found on any of these websites. And it is unusual that no editing is performed in a writing center. Yeah, so it looks like you're finding some pretty interesting things. It is unfortunate that the staff in many writing centers are not ESL trained, so it's a great thing if a school has an ESL writing center available to students. Okay, so T. Vega says that he was curious to know how you deal with grammatical errors, and that's a really good question. So whenever a writing center or a student comes to the writing center, they bring their paper, and here's how it went at UT Martin, and different writing centers have different policies and practices. But I think a lot of them are quite similar to what I'm going to describe. So a student would come into the writing center with their work, and usually with the assignment sheet as well, because one of the jobs of the writing center tutor is to help the student understand the assignment. Many times that's a barrier. So the student would sit down with the writing center tutor. When I was making notes for this session, I put that the first step in a writing center tutoring session was to read the student's paper. That's not right. The first step is to ask the student what his or her concerns are. Okay, so that's something that I personally don't think that I do enough of in my teaching, even though I had this experience of doing it constantly in the writing center. Okay, so I would ask, what are your concerns? What do you want me to look for as I'm reading? And then I would read the essay, the entire essay. And this is another thing that I think is kind of counterintuitive, perhaps. A lot of times when I sit down to grade papers, I have a pen in my hand, I have the rubric right there, and I'm reading, I'm writing, I'm marking on the rubric, I'm doing all of these things. But I started to think about my experience in the writing center, and rule number one was read the entire essay before you make comments and before you start discussing the essay. So read the essay, look for issues in organization, look for recurring grammatical errors, okay? At least in the writing center, if there were grammar mistakes, that wasn't really the issue, because the goal wasn't to create a perfect piece of writing. It was to use the writing as a tool to help the writer become better. So little grammar mistakes or word choice issues that are isolated incidents, they might make the essay not perfect. They might make the essay frustrating to read, perhaps. But if a grammatical mistake isn't a learning opportunity, we would ignore that. And, you know, obviously when you're teaching, ESL, EFL, EAP, you may have different grammatical structures that you're working on in class, and those are the ones that you would address in the writing. But in the Writing Center, so that's a good question. If it's a serious mistake, don't ignore it if the student will be able to understand how to fix it. Okay? Yeah, highlighting, that's a good way to draw attention to these errors. But in the Writing Center, what we did was we were looking for higher order concerns and lower order concerns. And we were always distinguishing between these two things. So higher order concerns and lower order concerns. So lower order concerns can, of course, be a problem. They make things difficult to read at times, but you should only work on the lower order concerns after the higher order concerns are under control. So the higher order concerns are things like organization, rhetorical styles, and also the recurring grammatical errors. Okay? And I agree, writing is both a tool and a product. So you do need to think about your purposes for the assignment. Okay? If it's the final essay of the session, that's definitely a product. But if you're responding to a draft, it's good to first look for the recurring grammatical concerns and then move to the lower order concerns that are less of a learning experience and more of a, you need to fix this and this and this, because that's also an important part of learning, right? You have to be able to edit your own work. How would I define serious? I would say that serious errors, yeah, those are things that make the writing incomprehensible. Exactly, things that impede comprehension. And then also if it's so recurring that it's completely distracting, which in turn also impedes comprehension. So I would say that comprehension is a big thing, and also errors that betray the writer's purpose. Okay, so this comes in a lot with teaching students how to cite sources. If they're writing a persuasive essay and they use a source that doesn't really support what they're trying to say, I would call that a serious concern as well, and it's definitely a teachable moment because you can talk about the intended meaning of what they're saying. One thing that's interesting on the UT Martin Writing Center FAQ that I have not started using in my classes, but that I think is interesting, is if you go to the UT Martin site, number 2, I'll just copy and paste it into the chat box. The question was, will you write on my paper? And I think the answer is pretty interesting. Now, as a teacher, I write on students' papers. I do that because obviously teaching and having a writing center tutoring session are two very different things. In a tutoring session, it's one-on-one. In a classroom, when you're working with a student's essay, that's one-on-one, but it's you and the text. The writer may not be there, okay? But I think it's something, this thing of not marking on papers and the idea of ownership of the paper is really an interesting idea that I've been trying to incorporate a little bit more into my classes lately. One way to do this is through audio feedback. And that's something that I, as well as many of my colleagues, have started working on in the last couple of semesters, where you have the student's paper, and instead of writing on the paper, with comments, you read the paper and give comments. Students seem to really like that, and that way they can decide, they can consider the changes that you are suggesting, and they can either take them or not, okay? It's also a little bit more personal, and, you know, from my students, what they said about it, they said that they liked that their paper wasn't covered in red marks. So I think it's also a little bit less stressful for students if you can give feedback by audio, whether that's a screencast on the computer or just a recording on your phone or an audio device. Yeah, and screen capture is great because you can point out part of the text while providing audio feedback. One thing that I would consider is you still want to look at the text as a whole before you start breaking it up into pieces and looking for different errors and concerns that you want to address. So I would still suggest reading the essay first, sort of deciding in your mind what the big issues are, and then talking to the student about it and reading some of the key parts of the essay. Or you can read the entire essay out loud after you've already read it yourself so that the student can hear his or her writing. Yep, and you always want to go from global comments to specifics when you're doing this. And if they're doing one draft, you can respond a few different times. You can put those different types of comments in different colors of pen if you're doing written feedback. Or you can start by giving the global comments and then move to the specific if you are giving spoken feedback. Absolutely. If you have multiple drafts, the first few drafts can be for global comments, the last draft can be for specifics. Next, I'm going to show a resource that I found on the York Writing Lab website that I think is pretty interesting, and there's a link to the source down there, although you can't click it. Okay, so the goal of the York Writing Lab is to help students become academic writers, okay, and that involves the process as well as the product. The York Lab divides becoming an academic writer into 4 different parts. We've already talked about understanding writing tasks, okay, decoding assignments to meet your instructor's expectations. Questions are a big part of this. So instead of telling the student, this is what I want you to do, you can ask, what do you think I want you to do? Do you think this is an argumentative essay? What kinds of sources do you think I want you to use here? Okay, or you can take yourself out of it. You can say, what would an effective answer to this question be? Okay, it doesn't have to be the teacher raining down, you know. You can say, what, in your opinion, would an effective answer to this question be to help the student understand writing tasks? You're also working to develop effective writing strategies. Thank you for putting that link in there. Sorry about that. So working on developing effective writing strategies, again, that's going to involve a lot of asking questions and, you know, leaving ownership of the essay in the student's hands. Okay, there might be some mistakes that go unfixed, but you want the student to be able to learn from his or her mistakes. Okay, you don't want them to feel like they're dependent on you. You know, like, if you go through and mark all of their mistakes, some students will think, oh, I have all these mistakes, I need a teacher to fix them. Okay, but if you can find a few errors that are recurring and that you can help the student understand, maybe by giving them some guided practice, giving a grammar explanation, and then having them look for that mistake or error in their own essay. Those are strategies that students can actually use. They also need to participate in scholarly conversations by building on the ideas of others. And I would say that's where using source material comes in. And finally, students, this one might be a little controversial, but they should experiment with writing conventions. So the example question here is, can I say I? I get this question many times every semester. I answer with a question, you know, is there a reason to say I? Is there another way that you can say that? Okay, so they're learning to use important features of academic writing to their advantage. And of course, all of these things are evolving, as Tyson said. All right. So the big question is, what can ESL, EAP, and also EFL teachers learn from how writing centers approach feedback? Obviously, we as teachers who have maybe 20, maybe more, maybe less students in a class can't do 20-minute one-on-one sessions with students on all of their drafts of all of their papers, okay? But what we can do is remember some of the principles and philosophies that writing centers use and work to adapt those to our own classrooms. Okay, so that can be something as simple as putting down the pen, reading the essay, and then choosing 2 or 3 errors the student is making that you can teach the student how to avoid. Okay, these are not things that you fix, but things you can teach the student to work on independently. Using different forms of feedback. Okay, so I encourage you to experiment with audio feedback, okay, or giving students a task in class and then having 5-minute meetings with individual students where you discuss one concern, okay? Another thing that I've really been interested in lately, let's see, comes from Jennifer Gonzalez, and she uses a tool called single point rubrics. And I have a Google Drive with some documents that support this presentation, and I will put the link in the comments box. But here's a link to Jennifer Gonzalez's blog in which she talks about single point rubrics. And I really like single point rubrics because there's a column for things the student did well, evidence that the student has mastered a certain element of the writing process, and then a column for not yet, okay, things they need to continue working on. I used single point rubrics in combination with audio feedback, and it was very successful. I actually had a detailed rubric that you can find on the Google Drive. I'll go ahead and give you that link. And there you go. It was a very detailed rubric, but I asked students to look at the rubric and choose 2 or 3 things that they were most concerned about and put those on the single point rubric. Then I didn't make comments about anything else on the rubric except what the students had asked for. Okay, and that seemed to work pretty well. Okay. Yeah, and there's some sample writing in here. We didn't get to it, but there's an example paragraph from one of my students as well as an example essay. So if you are interested in looking at those, you can think about what some of the higher order concerns in those essays would be and what 2 or 3 recurring errors might be, okay, and then how you could address those. I also put some example rubrics. So keeping in mind these writing center philosophies and principles, I encourage you to look at those and, consider how they could be modified or used in combination with other feedback methods to provide really effective feedback. I also have a list of links under number 6, references, and then number 7, I had a spot where we could brainstorm. You can edit that if you want to keep the conversation going, but I think that for now we are out of time. So thank you for listening. Here's my contact information.
That's great, Kate. Thanks so much. Yeah. There's one question from Ludmilla in the chat box, which is about recurring errors. Maybe you can address that.
Okay, sure. Okay, so does the amount of errors marked in a paper increase together with the student's proficiency level? I would say no, because my goal and the goal of most Writing Center tutors has been to choose 2 or 3 recurring errors. So even if there are many other errors in the essay, we want students to have focused practice with 1, 2, or 3 errors that are manageable for them so they don't become overwhelmed. We want them to see concrete improvement, and it's harder to do that when they're working on 10 different types of errors. It's easier to say, okay, this draft is for these 2 or 3 errors, and then maybe the teacher can make a note of the other errors and address those in the next draft. So there will be more errors and mistakes with different students' levels, but I would still focus on the same number of errors. Thanks for that question.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions for Kate? I think you've actually done a really good job of preempting the questions, Kate.
Yeah, and I encourage you to look around on that Google Drive. I'm sorry we didn't get to it, but there are some interesting things to look at with this Writing Center stuff in mind.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming again to Kate's session, and thanks again, Kate. I really look forward to seeing you in person again.
Yeah, you too.
Absolutely. So this session has been recorded, and at the end of the day, all the recordings of the sessions will be available on the program. So in case everybody's a little bit unsure where that program is, although I don't know how you could be because you got here, so I'll put the link in there again. And let's talk a little quickly about what's coming up.